March 27, 1999. 20 miles northwest of Belgrade, in a field near the village of Bujanovci, Lieutenant Colonel Dani Zoltan sits in the cramped cabin of a P-18 spoon-rest radar, a Soviet-era system older than most of the pilots flying overhead. The screen before him glows faintly green, showing mostly empty sky. His SA-3 Goa missile battery, obsolete by Western standards, dismissed by NATO planners as barely capable of tracking subsonic turboprops, sits in launch position, camouflaged under trees and netting. Above him, in the darkness, an F-117 Nighthawk stealth attack aircraft approaches its target. Its radar cross-section, smaller than a ball bearing, has made it untouchable through 7,800 combat sorties over Iraq and Yugoslavia. No surface-to-air missile has ever locked onto it. No radar operator has ever held it on screen long enough to matter. What Zoltan does not know, what the pilot does not know, is that in 17 seconds, a confluence of factors invisible to both men will unravel a decade of American assumptions about low observable technology. The aircraft is stealthiest head-on. It has just turned. An ancient radar is scanning at the one wavelength where stealth coatings work least effectively. The bomb bay doors are open. What no one realized until that night was this: stealth had never been tested against an adaptive, patient adversary willing to treat American doctrine as a targeting solution. The technology worked exactly as designed, but the operational assumptions, the flight paths, the timing, the predictability, turned precision into vulnerability. If you genuinely enjoy carefully researched, nuanced historical narratives that explore the technical and strategic dimensions of military history, stories that avoid hype and stick to documented evidence, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe, but only if this approach truly matches what you value. Chapter 1: 17 Seconds of Lock. March 27, 1999. 2042 local time. Village of Bujanovci, 20 miles northwest of Belgrade. The P-18 spoon rest radar sweeps again. Zoltan has been watching NATO aircraft all evening. F-15s, F-16s, EA-6B, Prowlers, jamming his frequencies, all of them bright and obvious on screen, flying prescribed altitudes and routes. He knows they consider him irrelevant. His SA-3 battery, fielded in 1961, upgraded with modest improvements but fundamentally archaic, represents no credible threat to modern coalition strike packages. NATO intelligence briefs describe the SA-3 as effective against targets flying below 15,000 feet at subsonic speeds. The F-117 operates at medium altitude, its stealth rendering it effectively invisible. But Zoltan is not following Soviet doctrine. He is following something closer to guerrilla logic. He has positioned his battery in a different location every night, moving after each engagement or near miss, refusing to emit radar continuously, turning it on for short bursts, going dark, repositioning. He has studied NATO bombing patterns for weeks. He has noticed that certain aircraft arrive from the same general direction at similar times, following what appear to be deconfliction corridors to avoid mid-air collisions in crowded airspace. At 2042, he orders another sweep. The radar, operating in the VHF band, longer wavelengths, lower resolution, but less effectively countered by stealth coatings optimized for X-band fire control systems, paints the sky. A faint return appears, not the bright echo of an F-16, something far weaker. It flickers, nearly vanishes, then strengthens slightly. Zoltan has been briefed on the theoretical signature of stealth aircraft. He does not know if this is an F-117, but the return is moving at the right speed, the right altitude, the right direction. He makes a decision in less than 3 seconds. He brings the battery to alert, his targeting radar, and SA-3's fire dome system, operating in the I-band, a frequency somewhat higher than the VHF acquisition radar, but still lower than the X-band system stealth, was optimized against. Attempts to lock, the return strengthens. The F-117 has turned, exposing more of its planform to the radar beam. Its bomb bay doors are open, creating a radar reflector cavity. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, has just released his payload, 2 GBU-27 Payway 3 laser-guided bombs, aimed at targets in Belgrade. The doors remain open for post-release clearance checks. Firedome achieves lock. Zoltan's screen shows a steady track. He has perhaps 10 to 15 seconds before the return fades, before the aircraft maneuvers, before the geometry changes. He launches 2 V-601 missiles in rapid succession. Launch time, 2042 and 15 seconds. Inside the cockpit of the F-117, Dale Zelko sees the missile launch warning illuminate on his threat display. The system is not designed to detect SA-3 launches reliably. The warning is based on other sensors. He begins evasive maneuvers, but the F-117 is not built for high G turns. It is subsonic, optimized for stealth, not agility. The first missile passes nearby. The second detonates close enough that shrapnel punctures the left wing, severs hydraulic lines, and destroys flight control surfaces. The aircraft begins to tumble. Zelko ejects at approximately 25,000 feet. The F-117 Nighthawk, tail number 806, call sign Vega 31, impacts the ground near the village of Sakule at 2045. Zoltan's crew watches the explosion through night vision scopes. They do not yet know what they have shot down. They know only that the target was strange. Weak on radar, difficult to hold, unlike anything they have engaged before. Within minutes, NATO communications networks light up with confirmation. An F-117 has been lost. Zelko is rescued by a combat search and rescue team. 8 hours later, wreckage from the aircraft is secured by Serbian forces and later reportedly examined by Russian and Chinese military delegations. The shootdown is confirmed by US Air Force statements on March 28. NATO officials publicly attribute the loss to a lucky shot. Privately, the incident triggers immediate operational reviews. The F-117 fleet is temporarily grounded, flight paths are altered, tactics are revised. But the question remains, how did a Soviet-era missile battery, crewed by operators using analog systems, track and destroy an aircraft designed to be undetectable? Chapter 2. The setup. The world that built stealth invincibility. To understand what happened over Serbia, one must first understand what stealth meant to the United States Air Force in the years before March 1990. The F-117 Nighthawk was not simply an aircraft, it was the operational proof of a revolutionary concept. That radar cross-section reduction could render an aircraft effectively undetectable to enemy air defenses, allowing it to penetrate hostile airspace without fighter escort, without jamming support, without the massive suppression of enemy air defenses packages that had characterized every major air campaign since World War II. The program's origins trace to the late 1970s. Lockheed Skunk Works, under the direction of Ben Rich, responded to a Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency requirement for a low-observable strike aircraft. The resulting design, initially called Half Blue and later developed into the F-117, prioritized radar signature reduction above all other performance characteristics. The aircraft's faceted surfaces, sharp angles designed to reflect radar energy away from the emitter rather than back toward it. Curves were aerodynamically superior, but calculating their radar cross-sections required computational resources unavailable in the mid-1970s. Flat panels, arranged in specific geometric configurations, could be modeled with existing computer systems. The first Half Blue prototype flew in December 1970. Development proceeded in secrecy at Groom Lake, Nevada. The F-117 entered operational service in October 1983 with the 4450 Tactical Group at Tonopah Test Range Airfield. The aircraft's existence was not publicly acknowledged until November 1988. By the time of the Gulf War in 1991, the F-117 had become the Air Force's premier strike platform for high-value, heavily defended targets. During Operation Desert Storm, 42 517s flew 1,299 combat sorties. They struck leadership bunkers, communication nodes, air defense headquarters, and chemical weapons facilities. All targets located in the most heavily defended airspace in Iraq. Not a single F-117 was damaged by enemy fire. Not one was tracked reliably enough for an Iraqi SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, or SA-8 battery to achieve missile lock. Iraqi air defense operators reported seeing aircraft on radar briefly, then losing them returns that flickered and vanished, impossible to sustain long enough for engagement. The performance was extraordinary. Air Force briefings described the F-117 as having completed its missions with no losses, no battle damage. The aircraft's radar cross-section was classified, but public estimates suggested it was comparable to a small bird, perhaps 0.001 to 0.01 square meters, depending on aspect angle. Conventional fighters like the F-15 or F-16 had radar cross-sections in the range of 1 to 5 square meters. The difference was not incremental, it was categorical. This success created a narrative. Stealth worked. It worked so well that it rendered traditional air defenses obsolete. An F-117 could fly into the heart of enemy airspace, strike its target, and return without ever being detected. The aircraft's loss rate, 0 in combat, reinforced the perception of invulnerability. But this narrative rested on specific assumptions, many of which were not articulated clearly even within the Air Force. First, that adversaries would rely on traditional fire control radars operating in the X-band and Q-band frequencies, the bands for which stealth coatings and shaping were optimized. Second, that adversaries would employ air defenses in the manner Soviet doctrine prescribed: static emplacements, continuous radar emissions, centralized command and control. Third, that adversaries would lack the intelligence, training, or initiative to adapt to American tactics. Or fourth, that operational security, varying flight paths, timing, and ingress routes would be maintained rigorously enough to prevent pattern recognition. These assumptions were reasonable given the adversaries the F-117 had faced. Iraq in 1991 operated Soviet, supplied air defenses with Soviet training and Soviet doctrine. Iraqi radar operators were competent, but they followed procedures designed for a different kind of war. A war where NATO aircraft would fly in large formations, predictably within range of overlapping SAM coverage. The F-117 violated all those assumptions. It flew alone. It flew at night. It struck without warning. Iraqi air defenses, built to counter mass raids, could not adapt quickly enough to engage a single, low-observable aircraft arriving from an unexpected vector. But Serbia, in 1990, was not Iraq. The Federal Republic of Yugoslavia operated many of the same air defense systems, SA-2Cs, SA-3s, SA-6s, but it was defended by personnel who understood that they were facing an adversary with total air superiority, comprehensive electronic warfare capabilities, and precision-guided munitions. They knew they could not win a conventional air defense battle. So they did not fight one. Yugoslav Air Defense Forces, under the command of Colonel General Spasoje Smiljanic, and coordinated at the operational level by officers like Lieutenant Colonel Zoltan Dani, adopted tactics that inverted NATO's assumptions. They refused to emit radar continuously, denying NATO anti-radiation missiles their targets. They moved frequently, abandoning fixed sites in favor of mobile deployments. They studied NATO strike patterns, looking for predictability. They accepted that most NATO aircraft were beyond their engagement envelope and focused instead on creating conditions where even a low probability shot might succeed. This was asymmetric warfare applied to air defense. The goal was not to shoot down large numbers of NATO aircraft. The goal was to impose costs, create uncertainty, and demonstrate that even stealth was not absolute. What made this possible was not advanced technology. Yugoslavia did not possess modern S-300 systems or advanced phased array radars. What made it possible was operational discipline, pattern analysis, and a willingness to treat stealth as a solvable problem rather than an insuperable barrier. And there was one other factor, quieter but critical: the F-117's operational tempo. By late March 1990, the F-117 fleet had been flying combat sorties over Yugoslavia for weeks. Missions were planned centrally, coordinated through combined air operations centers, and executed along routes designed to avoid known SAM threats and deconflict with other coalition aircraft. This deconfliction, necessary to prevent mid-air collisions in crowded airspace, created predictability. Aircraft flew similar altitudes, similar approach vectors, similar timing windows. Zoltan's unit had been tracking these patterns. They did not need to detect the F-117 directly on every mission. They needed only to know where it was likely to be, when it was likely to be there, and what frequency band might offer the best chance of detection. On the night of March 27th, all the variables aligned. The F-117 flew a route it had flown before. It arrived at a time consistent with prior missions. It turned, exposing a larger radar cross-section. It opened its bomb bay doors. And a VHF radar, operating at a wavelength poorly countered by the aircraft's stealth design, swept the sky at the exact moment the geometry favored detection. The shootdown was not luck, it was the convergence of disciplined asymmetric tactics and an operational assumption predictability that no amount of stealth technology could overcome. Chapter 3. The problem. Why stealth alone could never be enough. Stealth technology, as embodied in the F-117, was never designed to make an aircraft completely invisible. It was designed to reduce the range at which an aircraft could be detected and tracked to a distance shorter than the engagement envelope of existing air defense systems. This distinction is critical. A conventional fighter, say an F-16, might be detected by an SA-3 batteries acquisition radar at a range of 80 to 100 kilometers. The SA-3's maximum engagement range is approximately 25 kilometers. This gives the air defense system ample time to track the target, achieve fire control lock, and launch missiles. An F-117, with its drastically reduced radar cross-section, might not be detected until the range closes to 15 or 20 kilometers, well inside the SA-3's engagement envelope, but only briefly. The window for detection, tracking, lock, and launch is compressed to seconds. If the radar operator hesitates, if the geometry is unfavorable, if the aircraft's aspect angle changes, the opportunity vanishes. The F-117's stealth characteristics were optimized against specific threats. The aircraft's shaping and radar-absorbent coatings were designed primarily to counter X-band and Ku-band fire control radars, the frequencies used by most surface-to-air missile systems and fighter intercept radars in the 1980s and early 1990s. Against these systems, the F-117's radar cross-section was extraordinarily low, often cited in unofficial estimates as less than 0.01 square meters head-on. But stealth coatings and shaping are frequency-dependent. Lower-frequency radars, VHF and UHF bands, have longer wavelengths that interact differently with stealth features. A faceted surface designed to deflect centimeter wavelength X-band radar does not deflect meter wavelength VHF radar as effectively. The radar-absorbent materials applied to the F-117 skin are optimized for specific frequency ranges and lose effectiveness outside those ranges. This was understood by the aircraft's designers. It was a known limitation. But it was not considered operationally significant because VHF and UHF radars have poor resolution. They can detect the presence of a target, but they cannot provide the precise tracking data needed for missile guidance. Fire control systems, the radars that actually guide missiles to intercept, operate at higher frequencies where stealth is most effective. The logic was sound. Even if a VHF acquisition radar detected an F-117, the subsequent fire control radar would not be able to maintain lock long enough to guide a missile. But this logic assumed that the fire control radar and the acquisition radar operated at vastly different frequencies. It assumed that the transition from acquisition to fire control would break the track. In the case of Zoltan's SA-3 battery on March 27, the transition was less abrupt than American planners anticipated. The P-18 spoon rest acquisition radar operates in the VHF band around 145 to 175 MHz. The SA-3's Firedome fire control radar operates in the I-band, around 8 to 12 GHz, higher frequency, but not as high as the X-band radars against which the F-117 was most optimized. This meant that while the F-117 stealth characteristics reduced its visibility to Firedome, they did not eliminate it entirely, especially under favorable geometric conditions. When the P-18 detected a faint return and the Firedome attempted to lock, the aircraft's bomb bay doors were open. This created a cavity, a radar reflector, that significantly increased the aircraft's radar cross-section from certain angles. The F-117's designers had known this. Bomb bay doors were kept closed except during weapons release. But during the seconds they were open, the aircraft was more detectable. Additionally, the F-117 had just completed a turn. Stealth aircraft are stealthiest when viewed head-on because their shaping deflects radar energy away from the emitter. When viewed from other angles, especially from the side or below, the radar cross-section increases. The turn exposed the F-117's planform to Zoltan's radar at a more detectable aspect. Finally, the aircraft's speed and altitude were predictable. NATO had established deconfliction procedures to prevent collisions between the many aircraft operating in Yugoslav airspace. These procedures created altitude blocks and timing windows. The F-117 flew at medium altitude, around 20 to 25,000 feet, well within the engagement envelope of the SA-3, which could reach altitudes of up to 60,000 feet. None of these factors alone would have been sufficient. The P-18's VHF return was faint. The Firedome's lock was brief. The bomb bay doors were open for only seconds. The aspect angle was favorable for only a short window. But together they created a 17-second opportunity. Zoltan's crew took it. This revealed a fundamental truth about stealth that had not been tested operationally until that moment. Stealth reduces probability, but it does not eliminate vulnerability. It compresses the engagement window. But if an adversary is patient, disciplined, and willing to wait for the exact conditions where geometry, frequency, and aspect align, a shot is possible. The F-117 was not invulnerable. It was merely very, very difficult to hit, and only if the adversary played by the expected rules. Chapter 4. The Misread. Why smart people got it wrong in the months and years before March 1990. American air power planners made a series of assumptions about the F-117 that were not wrong exactly, but incomplete. They assumed that adversaries would fight the way they had been trained. They assumed that stealth's technological superiority would dominate the engagement geometry. They assumed that predictability could be managed through operational security. And they assumed that the air defenses of a small Balkan nation, equipped with systems designed in the 1960s, posed no meaningful threat to the most sophisticated strike aircraft in the US inventory. Each of these assumptions was reasonable. Each was supported by evidence, and each contributed to the conditions that made the shootdown possible. The assumption that adversaries would fight doctrinally was based on decades of experience. Soviet air defense doctrine, as practiced by Warsaw Pact forces and exported to client states, emphasized centralized command, continuous radar emissions, and overlapping coverage zones. SAM batteries were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Radar systems were kept active to provide early warning and continuous tracking. Command posts coordinated engagements across multiple batteries. This doctrine worked well against Cold War-era NATO tactics, which relied on mass formations, electronic jamming, and suppression of enemy air defenses. It worked less well against stealth because stealth invalidated the assumptions of continuous tracking and overlapping coverage. But Yugoslav air defense forces in 1999 did not follow Soviet doctrine rigidly. They adapted. They turned radars off to avoid anti-radiation missiles. They moved batteries frequently to avoid targeting by NATO strike aircraft. They refused to coordinate across multiple sites electronically, relying instead on landline communications and couriers to avoid signal interception. This adaptation was not secret. NATO intelligence was aware that Yugoslav SAM batteries were mobile and disciplined, but the assessment was that even an adaptive adversary could not overcome the F-117's stealth characteristics. The aircraft's radar cross-section was simply too low. Even if a VHF radar detected a faint return, the fire control radars needed for missile guidance would not achieve lock. What planners underestimated was the willingness of Yugoslav operators to wait for the perfect shot. Zoltan's battery did not engage every NATO aircraft that overflew his position. He engaged only when conditions were favorable, when the target's altitude, speed, and aspect created a realistic chance of success. Most nights, he did not fire at all. This discipline created a paradox. The more cautious and selective Zoltan was, the more dangerous he became. By refusing to engage unless conditions were ideal, he avoided revealing his position prematurely. By studying NATO patterns, he increased the probability that when he did engage, the target would be where he expected it to be. The assumption that stealth would dominate the engagement was also reasonable. In every prior combat employment, Panama in 1989, Iraq in 1991, and earlier missions over Yugoslavia, the F-117 had operated without loss. Its stealth characteristics had proven effective against a wide range of threat systems. There was no documented case of an F-117 being tracked reliably enough for a SAM battery to achieve fire control lock and launch. But this track record created overconfidence. The absence of losses was interpreted as evidence of invulnerability rather than as evidence of effective tactics, combined with adversary limitations. The F-117's invulnerability was never absolute. It was probabilistic. Every mission involved some level of risk, however small. The risk was managed through operational security, varying routes, timing, and altitudes to prevent pattern recognition. But as the air campaign over Yugoslavia extended into its second and third week, maintaining that variability became harder. There were only so many routes into Belgrade. Only so many altitudes that kept the F-117 within its optimal performance envelope while avoiding conflicts with other coalition aircraft. Only so many timing windows that aligned with target assignments and tanker support. Predictability increased incrementally. Each mission added data points. Yugoslav air defense operators, watching and waiting, began to notice patterns. The assumption that operational security would prevent pattern recognition was undermined by the sheer scale of the air campaign. NATO flew hundreds of sorties per night. Deconfliction required coordination. Coordination required structure. Structure created patterns. Zoltan later stated in interviews that his unit tracked NATO operations carefully, noting the times when certain aircraft types appeared, the altitudes they flew, the directions they approached from. He described watching F-117s on radar, brief, faint returns that appeared and vanished, and noting the consistency of their flight paths over multiple nights. This kind of passive observation was difficult for NATO to counter. Zoltan's battery did not emit radar continuously, so it could not be targeted by anti-radiation missiles. It moved frequently, so it could not be struck preemptively. It engaged selectively, so it did not waste missiles or expose itself unnecessarily. American planners knew that stealth was not a panacea. They knew that determined, adaptive adversaries could pose risks, but the assessment was that the risks were manageable. That even under unfavorable conditions, the F-117's stealth would degrade enemy engagement probabilities to the point where losses would be statistically negligible. And for 7,800 sorties, that assessment held. Then it didn't. The shootdown on March 27th was not the result of a single failure. It was the result of accumulated predictability, combined with an adversary who understood that predictability, combined with a brief window where geometry and frequency aligned. In retrospect, the mistake was not technological. The F-117 stealth worked as designed. The mistake was doctrinal. The assumption that an adversary equipped with obsolete systems could not exploit the narrow vulnerabilities that stealth left open. Zoltan proved that assumption wrong in 17 seconds. Chapter 5. The Hidden Strength. The one advantage they didn't see coming. What NATO planners did not fully anticipate, what perhaps could not have been fully anticipated, was the tactical advantage of operational patience combined with technical improvisation. But avoiding detection is not the same as being immune to engagement. The distinction matters. An aircraft that cannot be detected cannot be targeted. An aircraft that can be detected briefly under specific conditions can be targeted. if the adversary is willing to wait for those conditions and capable of acting within the compressed engagement window they create. Zoltan's hidden strength was not technological. His SA-3 battery was not upgraded with modern phased array radars or digital fire control systems. His P-18 spoonrest radar was analog, slow scanning and limited in resolution. His fire dome tracking radar was decades old. His advantage was methodological. First, he treated stealth as a problem to be solved, rather than an insurmountable barrier. He understood, either through training or through empirical observation, that VHF radars, long-wavelength systems, could sometimes detect low observable aircraft that higher frequency systems missed. He positioned his P-18 to sweep likely ingress routes at intervals, going dark between sweeps to avoid anti-radiation missile targeting. Second, he studied patterns. Yugoslav air defense units maintained logs of NATO activity. They noted the times when strikes occurred, the directions from which aircraft approached, the altitudes they flew. Over weeks, patterns emerged. Certain aircraft types appeared at similar times, certain routes were used repeatedly. Zoltan later recounted in interviews that his unit had observed F-117s on radar multiple times before the shootdown. These detections were fleeting, brief returns that appeared and vanished, but they were consistent enough to suggest flight paths. By correlating detection times with known NATO strike activity, Zoltan's crew developed a sense of when and where the F-117s might appear. This kind of pattern analysis required discipline and record-keeping. It required resisting the temptation to engage prematurely. Most importantly, it required accepting that most nights would pass without a viable target. Third, Zoltan modified his tactics to maximize the probability of detection during the brief windows when it was possible. He positioned his battery along likely ingress routes. He timed his radar sweeps to coincide with expected arrival windows. He kept his fire dome radar ready to transition immediately from acquisition to lock if the P-18 detected a return. Fourth, he exploited the F-117's operational constraints. Stealth aircraft are not invisible to all sensors. They are difficult to detect with radar, but their infrared signatures, while reduced, are not zero. Their engine noise, while quieter than conventional fighters, is audible at close range. Yugoslav observers stationed near likely flight paths listened for engine sounds and relayed sightings via landline to air defense units. These acoustic observations were imprecise. Too imprecise for targeting, but they provided confirmation that aircraft were operating in a given area at a given time. This allowed Zoltan to focus his radar sweeps on specific sectors rather than scanning the entire sky. Fifth, and perhaps most critically, Zoltan accepted risk. Engaging a stealth aircraft meant omitting radar in the presence of NATO electronic warfare assets and anti-radiation missiles. It meant exposing his position. It meant firing missiles at a target he could barely hold on screen, with no certainty of success. Most air defense operators, facing these odds, would not fire. The risk of counterattack outweighed the low probability of a kill. Zoltan fired anyway. He later described his decision-making process in interviews. He saw a faint return on the P-18, consistent with the weak signatures he had observed before. He ordered the fire dome to attempt lock. The lock held, briefly. He had seconds to decide. He launched 2 missiles in quick succession, knowing that even if both missed, he would have to reposition immediately to avoid retaliatory strikes. The missiles did not miss. What made this possible was not superior technology. It was the inversion of NATO's operational assumptions. NATO assumed that stealth would dominate the engagement. Zoltan assumed that stealth created a narrow vulnerability window and positioned himself to exploit that window when it appeared. NATO assumed that outdated air defense systems could not adapt to modern tactics. Zoltan adapted by abandoning Soviet doctrine and improvising tactics based on observation and pattern recognition. NATO assumed that air defense operators, facing overwhelming NATO air superiority, would be risk-averse and reactive. Zoltan was neither. He accepted the risk of exposure and acted decisively within the brief window his radar provided. The hidden strength was not in the hardware. It was in the willingness to treat technological disadvantage as a constraint to work within rather than a defeat to accept. And there was one more factor, less discussed but operationally significant: the F-117's mission profile. On the night of March 27, the aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, was assigned to strike targets in Belgrade. The targets were located in heavily defended airspace. The F-117 approached from the northwest, following a route that brought it within range of multiple SAM sites. The route had been used before. The timing was consistent with prior missions. The altitude was predictable. None of this was the result of negligence. NATO mission planners were aware of the risks, but the constraints were real. Belgrade had to be approached from certain directions to align with target coordinates. Altitudes had to fall within specific ranges to optimize weapons release. Timing had to synchronize with other coalition aircraft to avoid mid-air collisions and ensure coordinated strikes. These constraints were unavoidable, but they created predictability. And predictability, for an adversary as patient and observant as Zoltan, was exploitable. When Zelko opened his bomb bay doors to release his weapons, the F-117's radar cross-section increased momentarily. When he turned after weapons release, the aircraft's aspect changed, presenting a larger profile to ground-based radars. These were standard procedures necessary for mission execution, but they created the brief window Zoltan needed. The shootdown was not luck. It was the convergence of operational discipline, pattern analysis, and tactical opportunism, leveraged against an adversary whose predictability, however slight, was sufficient. Chapter 6. The Proof. The night the Untouchable burned 2042 hours, March 27, 1990. The sky over Serbia is crowded. Dozens of NATO aircraft are airborne. F-15s flying combat air patrol, F-16s striking airfields, EA-6B prowlers jamming air defense radars, tankers orbiting at designated refueling points. The airspace is deconflicted meticulously. Altitudes are assigned, routes are coordinated, timing windows are synchronized. Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko, piloting F-117 Nighthawk tail number 806, call sign Vega 31, approaches his target from the northwest. He has flown combat missions before. 37 sorties over Iraq during Desert Storm. He knows the F-117's capabilities and limitations. He knows that stealth is not invincibility, but he also knows that no F-117 has ever been shot down in combat. The aircraft has flown 7,800 sorties without loss. The odds are overwhelming in his favor. His mission tonight is straightforward. Strike assigned targets in Belgrade, return to base. The ingress route is planned to avoid known SAM threats. His altitude, approximately 20 to 5,000 feet, keeps him above the effective range of most short-range systems, while remaining within the F-117's optimal performance envelope. The night is dark, visibility poor. Zelko relies on his instruments and his infrared targeting system. 20 miles to the northwest, Zoltan's SA-3 battery is ready. The P-18 spoon rest radar has been powered on and off intermittently throughout the evening, scanning for returns. Zoltan has positioned his launchers under camouflage netting, hidden among trees near the village of Bujanovci. His crew has been tracking NATO patterns for weeks. They know that F-117s have operated in this area before. They know the approximate times. They know the likely approach vectors. At 20:38, the P-18 completes another sweep. Nothing unusual. 4 minutes later, at 20:42, another sweep begins. A faint return appears on the screen. Weak, flickering but moving. Zoltan has seen returns like this before. He suspects, but cannot confirm, that this is an F-117. The return is too weak to be a conventional fighter. It is moving at the right speed and altitude. The geometry is favorable. The target is approaching, not receding, which increases the probability of detection. Zoltan makes his decision in seconds. He orders the Firedome fire control radar to attempt lock. Firedome powers on. The radar operates in the I-band, around 8 to 12 GHz. Higher frequency than the P-18, but still lower than the X-band systems the F-117 was optimized against. The radar beam sweeps the sector where the P-18 detected the return. The return strengthens. The target has turned slightly, exposing more of its planform to the radar. At this moment, inside the cockpit of Vega 31, Zelko is completing his bomb run. His bomb bay doors are open. 2 GBU-27 Pave-3 laser-guided bombs drop free, guided toward their targets by infrared seekers. The doors remain open briefly for post-release clearance checks. The open bomb bay creates a cavity, a corner reflector, that drastically increases the F-117's radar cross-section from certain angles. For a few seconds, the aircraft is significantly more detectable. Firedome achieves lock. The screen shows a steady track. Zoltan's crew has perhaps 10 to 15 seconds before the target's aspect changes, before the bomb bay doors close, before the geometry becomes unfavorable again. Zoltan does not hesitate. He launches the first V601 missile at 20:42 and 15 seconds. 2 seconds later, he launches the second. The V601 is a command-guided missile, meaning it relies on continuous radar tracking from the Firedome system to intercept its target. The missile does not have its own seeker. It follows commands radioed from the ground, based on the radar's tracking data. This makes the missile dependent on sustained lock. If the radar loses the target, the missile loses guidance. Zoltan's crew must hold the lock for the entire flight time, approximately 15 to 20 seconds. They hold it. Inside Vega 31, Zelko sees the missile launch, warning illuminate on his threat display. The warning system is designed to detect missile launches based on infrared signatures and other sensors, but it is not optimized for SA-3 engagements. Zelko's training has prepared him for this moment, but the F-117 is not built for evasive maneuvering. It is subsonic, designed for stealth, not agility. He initiates a turn attempting to change aspect and deny the incoming missiles a clean shot. The first missile passes nearby, missing by a narrow margin. The second missile detonates close enough that shrapnel punctures the left wing root, severs hydraulic lines, and destroys control surfaces. The F-117's fly-by-wire flight control system loses hydraulic pressure. The aircraft begins to roll uncontrollably. Zelko attempts to stabilize, but the damage is catastrophic. The aircraft is no longer flyable. At approximately 25,000 feet, he pulls the ejection handles. The canopy blows clear, the ejection seat rockets him out of the tumbling aircraft, the parachute deploys. Zelko descends through cold night air, watching his aircraft spiral downward. The F-117 impacts the ground near the village of Sokole at 2045, creating a fireball visible for miles. On the ground, Zoltan's crew watches the explosion. They do not yet know what they have shot down. They know only that the target was unusual. Weak on radar, difficult to hold unlike any conventional aircraft they have engaged before. Zoltan orders an immediate repositioning. He knows that NATO will retaliate. His battery must move before anti-radiation missiles or strike aircraft arrive. Within minutes, the launchers are disassembled, loaded onto transports, and relocated. No retaliation comes. NATO does not know precisely where the missile was launched from. The engagement was too brief, the radar emissions too short, for NATO electronic warfare systems to triangulate Zoltan's position accurately. Zelko lands in a field. He activates his survival radio and establishes contact with NATO combat search and rescue forces. Serbian forces are searching for him. He evades capture for 8 hours, moving through farmland and forests, avoiding roads and villages. At 0445 on March 28, an MH-53 Pavlo helicopter, supported by A-10 Warthogs and F-16X, tracks him under fire. He is flown to safety. The wreckage of Vega 31 is secured by Serbian military forces within hours. Photographs show the aircraft's shattered fuselage, its distinctive faceted surfaces, its radar-absorbent coating. Parts of the wreckage are later reportedly examined by Russian and Chinese military delegations, though the extent of any intelligence gained remains disputed. NATO confirms the loss publicly on March 28. Initial statements describe the shootdown as a lucky shot or the result of a golden BB, military slang for a 1 in a million hit. Privately, the reaction is more complex. The F-117 fleet is temporarily grounded. Flight paths are reviewed, tactics are revised, questions are asked. How did a Soviet-era SAM battery track an aircraft designed to be undetectable? Was the loss an anomaly, or did it reveal a systematic vulnerability? Could it happen again? The answers were uncomfortable. The loss was not purely luck. It was the result of an adaptive adversary exploiting narrow windows of vulnerability through disciplined pattern recognition and tactical patience. The F-117 stealth worked as designed, but stealth alone could not overcome predictability. The wreckage was analyzed. The mission profile was reconstructed. The radar data where available was reviewed. The conclusion was clear. The shootdown occurred because multiple factors aligned simultaneously: VHF detection, favorable aspect angle, open bomb bay doors, predictable routing, and because the adversary was prepared to act within the brief window those factors created. Stealth was not broken, but the operational assumptions surrounding stealth, the belief that technological superiority alone could guarantee survivability, were revealed as insufficient. The lesson was not that the F-117 was flawed. The lesson was that no technology, however advanced, eliminates vulnerability. It only reduces probability. And probability, given enough opportunities and a sufficiently determined adversary, eventually converges toward an outcome. On March 27, 1990, that outcome was a fireball over rural Serbia. Chapter 7. Conclusion. The scoreboard and the permanent change. The shootdown of F-117 tail number 806 changed the calculus of stealth warfare in ways that extended far beyond the immediate operational impact. In the near term, the loss forced the U.S. Air Force to revise its F-117 employment doctrine. Flight paths were varied more rigorously. Timing windows were randomized. Altitudes were adjusted. The assumption that predictability could be managed through standard operational security was replaced with a more stringent approach. Assume the adversary is watching, learning and adapting. Assume that patterns, however subtle, will be detected and exploited. The F-117 fleet returned to combat operations over Yugoslavia, but the missions were conducted with greater caution. The aircraft's invincibility, never absolute, but perceived as such, was tempered by the recognition that stealth created advantage, not immunity. In the longer term, the incident influenced the design and employment of next-generation stealth platforms. The F-22 Raptor, which entered service in 2005, incorporated lessons from the shootdown. Its stealth characteristics were optimized across a broader range of radar frequencies, reducing the vulnerability to VHF detection that the F-117 experienced. Its agility and speed, supersonic cruise capability, high G maneuverability, gave it options the subsonic, non-agile F-117 lacked. It was designed to avoid, evade, or suppress threats rather than relying solely on low observability. The F-35 Lightning II, developed in the years following the shootdown, integrated stealth with advanced electronic warfare systems, sensor fusion, and data link capabilities. The aircraft's designers assumed that adversaries would develop methods to detect stealth aircraft under certain conditions and built-in countermeasures. The ability to jam, deceive, or destroy threat radars before they could achieve sustained lock. These design philosophies reflected a shift in thinking. Stealth was no longer treated as a standalone solution. It was one element in a system of systems, integrated with jamming, suppression, speed, maneuverability, and intelligence, designed to create overlapping layers of survivability. The shootdown also influenced adversary development. The incident demonstrated that low observable aircraft were not invulnerable, that legacy systems, properly employed, could achieve kills under specific conditions. This encouraged nations developing air defenses to invest in low-frequency radars, integrated air defense networks, and tactics designed to exploit the narrow windows where stealth effectiveness degraded. Russia's development of VHF and UHF early warning radars, such as the Nebo-M system, was partly driven by lessons from the F-117 shootdown. These radars cannot provide the precision tracking needed for missile guidance, but they can cue higher frequency fire control radars to specific sectors, reducing the search volume and increasing the probability of detection. China's air defense development followed a similar trajectory. The reported acquisition of F-117 wreckage by Chinese military delegations, whether confirmed or not, symbolized the broader strategic lesson. Stealth could be studied, understood, and countered. The human dimension of the incident is also worth noting. Lieutenant Colonel Dale Zelko survived, was rescued, and continued his Air Force career. He later met Zoltan Dani in 2011 at an aviation event. The meeting, by all accounts, was cordial. Both men expressed respect for the other's professionalism. Zoltan became a symbol in Serbia, a defender who used ingenuity and discipline to challenge a technologically superior adversary. He was promoted and decorated. His account of the engagement, told in interviews and documentaries, emphasized the role of patience, observation, and tactical improvisation. He described the shootdown not as luck, but as the culmination of weeks of preparation and seconds of decisive action. For the United States Air Force, the loss was a reminder that air superiority is never guaranteed. Technology provides advantage, but advantage is not dominance. Adversaries adapt. They observe. They exploit weaknesses. The assumption that superior technology alone will prevail, without rigorous operational discipline, is a dangerous one. The F-117 was retired in 2008, replaced by more capable platforms. Its operational record, one loss in 7,801 combat sorties, remains extraordinary. But the single loss mattered more than the raw statistics suggested. It shattered a narrative. It demonstrated that even the most sophisticated systems have vulnerabilities, and that those vulnerabilities, if understood and exploited by a determined adversary, can be lethal. The scoreboard, in the most literal sense, is this: one F-117 lost in combat, one pilot rescued, one missile battery repositioned and never struck. But the broader accounting is more complex. The shootdown cost the United States an aircraft worth approximately $45 million in 1999 dollars, and exposed operational vulnerabilities that required immediate tactical adjustments. It cost the Air Force a degree of confidence in the absolute superiority of stealth. It forced a reckoning with the reality that predictability, not technology, had been the decisive vulnerability. For Yugoslavia, the shootdown provided a morale boost and a propaganda victory. It demonstrated that resistance was possible, even against overwhelming air power, but it did not change the outcome of the conflict. NATO's air campaign continued. Yugoslav air defenses were progressively degraded. The war ended with Yugoslav forces withdrawing from Kosovo in June 1999. The permanent change was doctrinal. The incident reinforced a principle that military planners have always known but occasionally forget: technology is a tool, not a guarantee. Its effectiveness depends on how it is employed, how adversaries respond, and whether operational assumptions match battlefield realities. Stealth remains a cornerstone of modern air power. But post-1999, it is employed with greater humility. The assumption is no longer that stealth aircraft are untouchable. The assumption is that they are difficult to detect, difficult to track, and difficult to engage, but not impossible. And that distinction drives tactics, training, and technology development. The F-117 shootdown demonstrated a truth that applies beyond stealth, beyond air defense, beyond the specific technologies involved. No system is invulnerable. Every advantage can be countered if the adversary is patient, disciplined, and willing to wait for the conditions where narrow vulnerabilities align. On the night of March 27, 1992-99, those conditions aligned for 17 seconds. In those 17 seconds, a Cold War-era missile battery, operated by a crew using analog equipment and improvised tactics, destroyed the most advanced strike aircraft in the world. The lesson is not that stealth failed. The lesson is that stealth, like all military technologies, works within constraints. When those constraints are understood and exploited, the improbable becomes possible. And the possible, given patience and discipline, becomes real.